What's up everyone, Vu of Vu Films, and I am back with another video. And today I'm outside my backyard with autumn colors, like a complete weird D-bag, filming a YouTube douchebag video for your viewing entertainment. And today's video is about the Sony a7S III and the Sony FX3, and why I switched from the Sony a7S III to the Sony FX3, and if you should switch if you have a Sony a7S III, or if you are currently in the market for a new camera that is more video centric and you want to join the Sony D-bag fanboy ranks along with me and plenty other tube douchers on the internet. Which one should you buy? And to be quite honest, when these cameras first came out, that decision would have been a lot more difficult, but I think it is easier now since the Sony FX3 recently got a firmware update about 2 months ago, version 2.0, that completely changed what this camera is or was or whatever. So when the Sony a7S III came out, I mean pretty much every Sony fanboy D-bag and their mother pre-ordered a Sony a7S III. I was waiting for this camera pretty much since the day I bought a camera back in like 2014. This Sony a7S III was considered the ultimate camera because of all the video features. Sony decided to pack in this small mirrorless alpha body, full frame, 4K 60, 4K 120, 10-bit, all that stuff. You know what I'm talking about. So yeah, everyone hopped on the Sony a7S III bandwagon and everyone bought it, and till this day I do not regret my purchase at all. I still love the Sony a7S III, and when I say I'm switching over to the FX3, my main camera, but I still have it. So I didn't, like, you know what I mean, I didn't trade it or I didn't sell completely all my Sony a7S IIIs to replace with FX3s. But after the Sony a7S III was released, everyone bought it, and pretty much a few months after it was shipped, Sony announced the Sony FX3, and to me and everyone else's surprise, like, we're like, what? Sony just released a Sony a7S III, basically, in like a cinema looking body with the same form factor pretty much as their alpha line, but it says cinema line, and they didn't change much else other than the viewfinder doesn't exist, and they force you to get the audio attachment handle with FX3, making the FX3 more expensive than the Sony a7S III by like 400 bucks. I believe the screen of the FX3 has slightly more dots than a7S III, but other than that, those are the main differences. Software, menu system, everything else was largely the same between the FX3 and the Sony a7S III, and I think most people's buying decisions were based on the price. The Sony a7S III was $3,500. Most of us, most running gun shooters, or even just, you don't really need that audio handle to be able to do professional level video work. You don't. So most people are just like, hey, look, I'm gonna just get the Sony a7S III. I have other audio solutions. I don't need that audio thing. The Sony a7S III does what I need. It has a viewfinder. They're pretty much the same thing. But of course, fast forward a couple years later, Sony decides to update the firmware on the FX3, and pretty much hasn't really done any major updates to the Sony a7S III since its release. So pretty much with the new firmware update of the Sony FX3, they've included a bunch of FX6, FX9 features, such as Cine EI, flexible ISO, all that stuff. I try to explain Cine EI in a bit, in the most basic of the basic terms, just so you understand what's going on. I barely understand it, to be quite honest with you, but I have been using the FX3 for the past couple weeks on 3 different shoots, specifically wedding filmmaking shoots. But Sony also updated the menu system in the FX3. It includes the ability to touch swipe to get the function menu up, as well as 2 separate custom menus for you to be able to touch and get into different menu items in your camera, access them quicker, more like one of their cinema cameras. One of the reasons why I decided to sell one of my Sony a7S IIIs and go ahead and get an FX3 was because of the LUT display. I'm actually able to load in custom LUTs into the FX3 and be able to monitor my footage right off of this screen with the LUT on the display without actually baking it into the log footage. But I could also bake it into the log footage if I want. But I felt like that's such an important feature because I'm straight, when I say I'm running gun, I'm straight running gun. I try not to even put a monitor on here. The most I put is probably a shotgun mic. This is because I just need to be able to put this, throw this in my bag, pull it out of my bag, and just film with it. You know, I don't feel like having to like taking monitors off, unmounting all these things to put on my gimbal. Like literally, like I film all day as is, just like this, and I just use my display to gauge exposure, to gauge composition and all that stuff. And by loading a LUT onto display, it really helps me see what the final image is, so that I don't have to like make additional adjustments in exposure in post and possibly degrading the image slightly, when I could like nail the exposure I want in post based off the LUTs I develop and then I put in here, and it's fantastic. And I actually didn't even know that the FX3 had these updates until the FX30 was released. And you know, I pre-ordered the FX30 and I was doing more research on it, and I realized, wow, like the FX30 is able to load on LUTs, and I realized FX3 was able to do that also. I actually have the FX30 coming in tomorrow, and I'll be doing a whole deep dive, and I'm gonna obviously use it on professional shoots, review it, and let you know what I think about it. But honestly, I think the FX30 is a great camera regardless, and if you're looking for the cheapest possible video camera, you want to stay with Sony, which I do highly recommend due to the E-mount lenses and the features, FX30 is well worth the price if you're budget minded. And the other reason why I decided to switch to the FX3 was because of Sony EI. Now, I didn't really understand exactly what it is, but I still don't. But the fact that I could switch from the base ISO of, oddly enough, when you go into Sony EI mode, the base ISO is 800 and 12,800. The Sony a7SIII with the same sensor is 640 and 12,800. But in flexible ISO mode in the FX3, which is pretty much makes it the same camera as the Sony a7SIII in terms of like the use of ISO and all that stuff, it actually goes back to 640 ISO and 12,800 ISO. So I don't know what the deal is with that. I don't know how this one sensor could have a base ISO of 640 or 800 and 12,800. I don't know how that works, but either way, it's great to be able to switch from 800 to 12,800 with just a press of a button, versus in flexible ISO mode in this, and in just regular mode here. To switch ISO, I actually have to scroll through all of it, which takes a while, and it's just great for me to just click a button, I'm at 12,800, click a button, and I'm at 800, and to me that's fantastic. Now the only thing that's kind of confusing is that you can actually adjust the exposure with the camera, and you'll see on the display the exposure reflected with your adjustments, but then the adjustments aren't baked onto your image. So if you're on ISO 800 on Sony EI mode and you start adjusting quote unquote your exposure by adjusting ISO levels, yeah, they'll show you how it looks like on the display with those ISO adjustments, but it doesn't actually apply to your camera. When you put that image into your editing system, it'll still be at base ISO 800, and you have to do those adjustments in post. And then it makes me curious, it's literally no difference if you bump ISO in either of these cameras to like, I don't know, 2,500, right, to get proper exposure. But let's say you film at base ISO, either 640 or 800, depending on which camera and which settings, and you're underexposed. But if you put that image in post and you increase the exposure slider on Premiere Pro or whatever, you know, editing program you use, in terms of like the noise level, it actually looks almost exactly the same. So whether you bump ISO on your camera, or if you just leave it at 800 or 12,800 and just leave the image as underexposed and then raise exposure and post later, the noise levels are the same. And essentially that is just how Sony EI works. So you know for a fact that if you're on ISO 800, that's the cleanest possible imagery that you could get out of the FX3 at its low base ISO, right? Once you see that you need to increase exposure to have proper exposure, which is like, you know, 2 stops to the right in the most basic form of S-Log3 exposure, you just go ahead and switch over to 12,800. And depending on the situation you're in, you either crank shutter, adjust your aperture, or you adjust your ND to maintain, you know, the proper exposure, because a lot of times likely you end up being very overexposed once you hit 12,800. But then once you're in 12,800 and you need to increase exposure, let's say you're doing some night shoots, you could either, on the A7S3, you bump ISO, right? You go ISO, you know, 51,200 or something. And this camera, essentially, in Cine AI mode, you just leave it at 12,800 and just film stuff underexposed and just raise exposure in post, and the noise levels should be the same regardless. I don't know what the in-camera noise reduction does when you bake in ISO in camera, but for the most part it seems to be the same. And if you need to add in noise reduction, you can go use Neat Video or whatever plugin your editor has. I believe DaVinci Resolve has a really good noise reduction built in. But yeah, that is that in a nutshell. Other than that, like, I just really love this body. After I've been using it, I really prefer using the FX3's body, the button layouts, all that stuff, over the Sony a7S III. I really like the screen bump out. The fan is great. You know, it does what it does. I don't think it needed it. At least the Sony a7S III never needed it for me, and the FX3 probably doesn't need it either, but had no overheating issues shooting 4K 60 majority of the day. Yeah, just overall, I just like the overall layout of the body. And, you know, with that being said, people might question, like, what is the future of the Sony a7S series of cameras? And I just don't know what the future is of the Sony a7S camera. I actually am very unsure about the Sony a7S future. I mean, let's say the next camera is an a7S IV, you would think that would also release an FX3 Mark II. I mean, as is, if you're a video shooter and you are looking into buying an FX3 or Sony a7S III, like today, like right now, those are the 2 cameras you're trying to pick from, I would go with FX3, especially if I'm a video shooter, like specifically. And if I was a photographer, like a professional photographer, where I'm doing like 50-50, or, you know, maybe 60% photography and some videography in here and there, I might lean towards a7 IV, just because a7 IV is more of a photography camera. But if you're a videographer and you kind of just shoot like photography from time to time, the FX3 will do the job. Obviously the Sony a7S III has this viewfinder, but I don't really need viewfinder to just shoot some basic photos for like Instagram or something. I even use like video screenshots if I had to for like a lot of like social media quote unquote photos. But yeah, like going forward, I'm really not sure what value the a7S holds other than like sensitivity, like in terms of like low light sensitivity for on the photo end. Obviously the FX3 has the same sensor, so it is also very low light sensitive. But the a7S III is supposed to be like the video centric. I mean, at least that's what tube boosters thought. But I think on Sony's end, a7S just meant sensitivity, meaning, you know, high ISO performance, not necessarily video performance. And I think back when the a7S II was released, it was just coincidence that at that time Sony was able to load in these, you know, new video features into the Sony a7S. But then of course they also loaded it into the a6500 immediately after that with better autofocus. So I don't think, you know, obviously Sony never meant this to be like the video centric camera. It's just what we perceived it to be, because at the time the Sony a7S II had the best video features Sony had to offer in these mirrorless bodies. Obviously things have changed. Pretty much any Sony camera you buy these days, even the Sony a7R5, which will be announced the next couple days, is going to have fantastic video capabilities. A1, a7 IV, etc. So yeah, the a7S III is no longer that video centric camera. It's really Sony's most light sensitive camera. And going forward, I believe the FX3 has taken over that role of the Sony a7S III being like that video centric camera. So whatever that Sony a7S camera is going to be, I guess it'll still be a photography camera with great sensitivity. But if I was a photographer, I'd probably just lean towards an a7 IV because of the extra megapixels. So yeah, the A7S series, this might be the end of it, in my opinion. Not necessarily the end of it, it's just going to transfer over to an FX series camera, like the FX3, FX4, FX3 Mark II, whatever they're going to call it in the future. And if you're a Sony a7S3 user right now, and you're thinking about switching to the FX3, I highly recommend it, to be quite honest. I just, obviously if you have the budget for it, but the FX3, definitely a solid camera if you are primarily a video shooter and do the occasional photos like I do. I highly recommend the Sony FX3. I also forgot, like, the info display that the FX3 does is actually a lot cleaner than the A7S, A7R, A7 IV, etc. Like, they just put all like details on like the black bars instead of having it all over the image. Just a cleaner look. I don't know why they haven't just switched all their cameras over to this. I think they might eventually will. I don't know, but I hope they would, because this FX3's display is like so much better than A7S3's display. With that said, guys, that is it for me between my comparison of the Sony a7S III and the FX3. I hope this video is interesting. I hope it helped you make a business decision. Till next time, lighten up your wallet.
Oh my god, that's your camera? You need more rig than that. You have no monitor. You have no external battery. It takes too long to change the battery. It's too much trouble, man. You need an all-day battery.
Bro, my running gun setup needs to be simple, man. Got to mount on and off gimbal.
No, man, you don't need a gimbal. Handheld, it's much more organic and too much trouble to mount. But it takes so long to take off. My rig setup just at fat.
Alright, man, let me see you go from handheld to gimbal with your rig.
Let me show you.
Bro, it's been over an hour. You're taking longer than Panasonic autofocuses.
When you the best, when you award winning, you take as long as you want.